Yes, happy Friday, everybody. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be back after a 2-year hiatus. I just reminded myself to put my phone on silent. If you want me to do the same. We're not in Israel, it's not in the border. It's a voluntary thing, but I think I'll speak a little louder. All right, I'm sending signals already that my voice is no longer terrorist. The hearing goes along with the ability of the vocal cords, but I'll do my level best to speak. My voice is fine. Welcome back. You know, it's anytime you sort of wake up in the morning and turn on your phone or your TV or read the paper, however you get your news, whatever you thought you were going to say the night before pretty quickly becomes stale. There's some more seats. You can just grab some chairs in the back and then help yourself with some food. It's nice to see some familiar faces, a few new faces, and I have extraordinarily warm feelings for this community, for this synagogue, and it's a real treat to be back. And the topics were chosen towards the end of last year, I think sometime in late November, early December, and clearly, given that we're 1 year into the new president's term in office, I thought that in the spirit of what we've been speaking about for several years, the leader of the free world, President Biden, deserves at least a full session to capture some of the successes and some of the less successful things that have punctuated his presidency over the past almost 13 months. It's really been a tale of two presidencies, and I think that's true on multiple levels. There's some more chairs in the back if you just want to pull them out. Help yourself. There's still some bagels and food. Let's look at who Joe Biden is. And I think we talked a little bit about him when President Obama was in office and he was the vice president. As the vice president, you're not as relevant, obviously. Joe Biden turned 79 on November 20th, so he'll turn 80 this year. He got elected to the Senate in 1972. He was 29 years old. He was at the time the 6th youngest person ever elected to the Senate. He had just suffered through an enormous personal tragedy where his wife and one of his children were killed in a car accident, and his children were hurt, but recovered, Bo and Hunter. Bo, tragically, has since passed away from breast cancer. So he's a man who's really endured hardship. He's had a life that's been dedicated nearly exclusively to public service, but he's always been extremely ambitious, and he's run for president twice in the past. He ran in 1988, which ironically, had he won, he would have been the second youngest president in American history after John Kennedy. He did win. He was a leading fundraiser up until just a series of we'll call them scandals, not like, Jerry Hart actually ran for president during the same cycle, and he had a scandal with Donna Rice on John Soper's boat here in Miami, actually, called Monkey Business. Biden's issues were different, mostly plagiarism. A lot of his speeches were pilfered from other politicians. It was revealed in a law review article that he'd written back, Syracuse Law School 20 years previously, had also been, he helped himself to other people's material. So he bowed out of that race. And he waited another 20 years to run for president again in 2008, and he just couldn't break into the Hillary-Obama show. I mean, for those, all of you remember 2008, Hillary was supposed to win the nomination and then the presidency, and she didn't. She didn't get the nomination. Barack Obama did and became president. And Biden became his vice president. And he was a very appropriate vice president, certainly for a candidate like then Senator Obama. He brought a lot of experience to the table. He'd been the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He supervised 6 Supreme Court nominations. Many of them didn't make it to the court, like Robert Bork, Ginsburg, but he was a very visible senator. He was involved in, he was never head of the Foreign Relations Committee, but he was involved in foreign relations, and campaigned by saying he had a lot more foreign policy experience experience than either of the other two candidates. Hillary had not been Secretary of State yet. I mean, her foreign policy credentials were, hanging out on Air Force One when her husband was president. And I think that's one of the reasons why Obama was the one nomination selected Joe Biden to be his running mate. And we'll talk a little bit about the Israel relationship in the Middle East and the role that Vice President Biden had. But when he came into office, I think the most telling credential that he had, and probably the single most important reason that he won, was that he wasn't Donald Trump. And love him or hate him, Donald Trump was an extraordinarily polarizing president. Now, since I've been politically sentient, I think that one of the biggest inflection points was 1994, during Clinton's first term, when Newt Gingrich put out the Contract for America, and the Republicans took back the House of Representatives. And, President Clinton was maligned and vilified, and he was impeached, and you had the whole Monica Lewinsky issue. So Monica Lewinsky, I kind of felt badly for her, but she was just a tool to which the Republicans could beat up on President Clinton. George Bush followed him. It was worse. George Bush was an idiot. He got us into useless wars. He couldn't handle the country after 9/11. Vilified even more so, until Barack Obama became president. And his detractors plain out said, it's our goal, Senator Mitch McConnell says, our goal is to make sure there's a one-term presidency. It wasn't. Trump's became a one-term presidency, and now in the last class we talked about what we can expect in the midterms, I'll talk a lot about Senator McConnell and former President Trump and what that relationship and other relationships mean for the future of the Republican Party, and talk about the Democratic Party as well. But right now, people were very, very pleased that we didn't have to endure another 4 years of office. People on the other side felt the election was stolen, and he did it, and thought that President Trump was a hero and needed to be given an extension of his mandate because so many good things were happening. There was a lot of that in the pro-Israel community. Ambassador Friedman, former Ambassador Friedman, literally published a book on Tuesday or Wednesday this week called Sledgehammer. I had an advanced copy of it, so I read the book a week ago. It's an interesting book. There's a pretty critical review of it in Times of Israel this morning. If you guys get your Israel news in English, I recommend reading it by Jacob Mackey. It's not favorable to the book, but the book outlines one of the themes that a lot of people who like Trump feel like they missed. He was a guy, the name of the title of the book is Sledgehammer. He was a guy who broke down walls, broke the rules maybe, but maybe that's because the rules needed to be broken. And what was done in the past was not successful. And whether it's Einstein or someone else who came up with the definition of idiocy, is doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results, the State Department was replete with people who thought that the old formulas would continue working when they hadn't. And if you look at the Abraham Accords, which is a topic that deserves its own full lecture, that was an achievement. And maybe you needed a president like Trump and a prime minister like Bibi Netanyahu and other sort of relevant players to choreograph that. But most of the country did not want Donald Trump to have a second term of office. And I don't know how you poll this, I don't know how you measure enthusiasm, but one of the most interesting polls that I recall before the election, but during the campaign in 2020, was that of those potential voters who were inclined to vote for Donald Trump, over 80% of those voters were extremely enthusiastic about Trump as a candidate. Of those voters who were inclined to vote for Joe Biden, fewer than 50% were enthusiastic about the candidate because he doesn't generate a lot of enthusiasm. And I don't know that the president needs to. And I think that now he's being criticized of pivoting way to the left into the progressive elements of the party. But during the campaign, and then during the election, he was really among the more moderate Democratic candidates. There were 27 people participating in the Democratic primary in 2020, which is just a mind-blowing number. I mean, I think that there are always these quizzes, if you can remember who won every Super Bowl, who won every hockey scoring championship, and it's hard if you get 15, out of 50 55, you feel like you've done pretty well. I don't know how many of us could remember over half the people who ran for the Democratic. I probably could get half, maybe 20. But there are a lot of them whose names we remember: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, Mayor de Blasio, Senator Gillibrand, Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, all of whom were way to the left. Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, I could keep going. Tom Steyer, all of them were way to the left of Biden. The only one I can think of who wasn't is Michael Bloomberg, and he had the most ridiculous campaign. Even if he weren't a brilliant businessman, I would have thought this was a pretty unfortunate way to run a campaign. He came here to the synagogue, actually. He spoke well. But whoever told him to get on a debate stage before he even ran in a single primary, should be giving kickoff advice to the coach of the Buffalo Bills if they're in football. But anyway, that was I don't know why he did that, and then he spent more than he spent on the campaign on Biden's run. But Biden was a centrist, and I think people were expecting competence when he got into office, and they got it. When Biden started his presidency, his approval ratings were high. They were comfortably in the high 50s, which is good. 50 really is, especially in today's environment, is a pretty good benchmark of an approval rating. I think a lot of people who either didn't vote for him or didn't vote for him enthusiastically were impressed. They were impressed that he got pretty significant pieces of legislation passed. He got the COVID rescue bill, $1.9 trillion. He got the infrastructure, not to be confused with Build Back Better, is more clean tech and investments in renewable energy and decarbonization. Infrastructure, just roads and bridges. We've got $1.2 trillion bipartisan. And people are saying, well, it's time in the Senate work. One of the main benefits that Vice President Biden delivered to President Obama was his ability to work within the Senate. He had, if you do the math, he had 36 years of experience working with senators across the aisle, and they passed the budget bill, and they passed other things that would have seemed pretty challenging in Obama's first couple of years in office. The Affordable Care Act was not really bipartisan. A couple of Republicans signed on. But in many instances, he was called to do that, and here it seemed like that magic would be replicated or even augmented when he's actually president of the United States. And then the summer happened. And I think that the inflection point in his presidency, certainly his first year of office, was Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, he was basically just promising to fulfill a commitment that President Trump had made. That they would be out of, said if I'm re-elected, we'll be out of Afghanistan by the end of 2021. And, Trump probably said a lot of things. But I was surprised. And I wasn't just surprised by the debacle that followed. It's not like in the first 24 hours of being president, Biden didn't reverse at least a dozen of Trump's executive orders, like he defunded the money allocated for the wall, he stopped the immigration policy from certain, or the non-immigration policy from certain Muslim countries. He immediately re-entered the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's not like just because Trump had said this that this president was bound. And it's not like the United States doesn't have small contingents of forces in so many countries around the world that do a lot of good. And just by being there, they don't really actually need to threaten anybody. But their mere presence sends a very strong signal. And in the case of necessity, they're much closer to where they need to be. Syria was an excellent example. Trump said, we're leaving Syria. And his defense establishment laced into it. We can't do that. We need to be in Syria. We need to at least have a small presence in Syria. So he backtracked. I mean, his own Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, you can't do that. And ultimately, that was one of the reasons that Mattis resigned, because Trump once again did something that he just couldn't bear anymore. But at the time, they reversed course. They had a small contingent. That's the same contingent that took out, 2 ISIS leaders most recently a couple of weeks ago. So, anyway, Biden was confident that this wasn't going to look like the departure from Saigon in April of 1975. I mean, we're all old enough. I remember being little kids seeing pictures of these helicopters taking people from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon, so that they can, they can escape, be among the last Vietnamese to escape before the country's handed over to Ho Chi Minh. But what we saw, which was very similar. I mean, just fast forward, 45 years, and you're essentially seeing the same thing. 46 years, you're seeing people holding on to the wheels of a Hercules aircraft transporter, and I'm sure some of them were probably crushed. I mean, it's easier not to make a helicopter than to try to hold on to a plane that's taking off. And it just looked bad. And regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, you don't need to think too hard about the signal that sends to other people in the world. Like Xi Jinping in China, we'll have a whole class dedicated to him in a couple of weeks. Vladimir Putin in Russia. You don't think there's any correlation between the United States' departure from Afghanistan and the behavior of Putin towards Ukraine or Xi Jinping towards Taiwan. I suggest you think about it a little bit more carefully. Even the Iranian saber rattling and the acceleration of centrifuge spinning, I think can be attributed to a perception that America is not as vigilant in its foreign policy and will be more ready to retreat from places where historically it felt it needed to have a presence. Mostly in the Middle East. And let's talk about the Middle East for a little bit. Because in the Middle East, this isn't something started by President Biden. It started under the Obama administration, accelerated under the Trump administration. The United States wants to pivot, as the phrase was coined by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, towards the Pacific. They want to pivot towards a rising China, now revanchist Russia, and the Middle East has just proven to be a quagmire for so many years. Now, the United States isn't running out of the Middle East immediately, but clearly the trend is towards a gradual departure. Israel, by the way, I believe, in some counterintuitive ways, benefits from that. Obviously, Israel doesn't want soldiers fighting its battles, and historically and admirably has never wanted anybody to lose, any foreigners to lose their lives over Israel's regional battles. But it's very comforting to Israel to have, the 6th Fleet in the Persian Gulf, the 5th Fleet in the Mediterranean, and to wield a considerable military presence in the region, and that's eroding. The fleets are still there, but the emphasis is shifting. Why does this help Israel? It helps Israel because Iran remains so belligerent. So you have relationships that started well before the Abraham Accords, and that just opened the door. But the treaties and relationships are really the product of necessity. If you're the United Arab Emirates, or you're the Kuwaitis, or you're the Saudis, or you're the Bahrainis, you're the Omanis, or the Qataris, even you're looking at Iran, you see an existential threat. And you look at the United States and you see them kind of walking away. And you look at Israel and you see this is a powerful military that keeps getting stronger and stronger and is single-mindedly dedicated to prevent Iran from going nuclear. So, what does that mean for President Biden? It means that he has a huge opportunity, and the huge opportunity is not to run back to the Middle East and bring in all the more forces into Syria and other places, but rather I think he needs a big win before November, and nothing's easy. And nobody asks me what I think in this administration or other administrations, but if I had his ear for 5 minutes, I'd say do whatever you can to get Saudi Arabia to the Abraham Accords. Whatever you can, whatever it takes. And yes, King Solomon, when he called up just this week, they had a conversation with the Port of the Press, they're contemporaries, so maybe they can communicate well with each other. The person who's really running the country is Mohammed bin Salman, who's the son of King Salman, MBS as it's called. And yeah, he had his fingerprints all over the Khashoggi murder. And Khashoggi was, a political critic. And the United States doesn't believe that you should assassinate your critics, by seducing them to come to your embassy in Turkey and then literally cutting them up into little pieces. That's barbaric. But if you think about geopolitical considerations, I think this administration needs to think about what it would mean if Saudi Arabia enters the Abraham Accords. Now, all the other countries that did, the UAE and Bahrain, think about it. The UAE actually, and here's where the critique of Ambassador Friedman's book, I think, is somewhat provocative and worth considering. The UAE, I think, had more than any other country to do with the whole Abraham Accords. The rapprochement behind closed doors, like I said, has been taking place for years. But here, the UAE ambassador in the United States, Youssef Al-Otaiba, who's an incredibly compelling guy. I did have the privilege of meeting him a few times over the years. He's a bit younger than I am, but he's been, he's part of the royal family. He grew up in Boston, Washington, and he speaks English as well as anybody else. And he speaks more loudly than I do, too. So I'll hold it closer. Is this better? Okay. Yay. So I'm not going to repeat all of the things that I said before, but I'm saying that the UAE really triggered the Abraham Accords in response to, or as a salve to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's set on annexing all the portions of Judea and Samaria that were allocated to Israel during the Trump Vision for Peace. That was, I think, the subject of the very last talk I gave in this room before the pandemic. But that was the first peace treaty that Israel had signed in 26 years, since 1994 with Jordan. 29 days, not years, 29 days later, Bahrain comes on board. Then Morocco, then Kosovo, actually, in Europe, which is not in the Middle East, but it is a Muslim nation, and then Sudan. Now, everybody got something. The United States was kind of like the Godfather, and that's the way they play politics. What did the UAE want? They wanted the F-35 strike jet fighters. They got them. Sudan wanted to be taken off the state-sponsored list of terrorists. They got that. Morocco wanted the United States to acknowledge its sovereignty over the Western Sahara. They got that. And the payback for all of these gifts, if you will, was entering the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with Israel, and those are real normalizations. The UAE, immediately after making peace, unlike Jordan, unlike Egypt, certainly unlike the Palestinians, stopped the rhetoric. Instead, and the rhetoric was somewhat abated already for many years. Instead, if you now go to the UAE, you can get kosher food in most restaurants. You can wear a kippah in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, probably with a lot less to worry about than in Cairo, Amman, or even Paris. So it's a big deal, it's the real deal, and these countries are all relevant countries, but they're not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the bedrock of Islam. It's the custodian of the two holy mosques. It's the largest oil exporter. The United States is the largest producer, but we also consume most of the oil we produce. Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of petroleum in the world, and is the swing producer. What that means is it determines the price of oil. By turning the spigot on or off, the global price of petroleum is determined in Riyadh. Sure, there's OPEC and some other countries are relevant, but Saudi Arabia really is the show in town. By getting Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, it would signal to every other Muslim country that's so inclined, not all of them are inclined, but to every single other Muslim country that might be so inclined, that it's part of the plan now kosher to have normalized relations with Israel. And I think the United States could try, but it means treating the Saudis, from their perspective, better, with more respect than they've been treated over the past year plus. MBS has been and remains persona non grata. The King Solomon is still the king, but I'm not saying anything that the people in Foggy Bottom, the State Department, or in Washington don't get. They get. They understand all of this. It's a question of prioritizing, and messaging and signal sending. So, does that happen? Frankly, I don't think so. But could it happen? I believe it might. Just at the beginning of this month, the United States still holds joint military exercises with Saudi Arabia, and the Israeli Navy participated in a U.S.-Saudi naval exercise literally a week and a half ago. So the Saudis are they're not uncomfortable having Israel, interlocutors that are Israeli, relationships with Israelis, but they're not ready yet to sort of come out of the closet and say we're going to normalize, because they still believe that across most of the Muslim world, not just the Arab world, the issue with the Palestinians becomes the critical issue. And unless that, some resolution. Now, I don't think anybody's expecting a broad peace plan, but I think they're expecting there to be more of a dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians, who haven't really sat down together in any meaningful way for many years. And Trump, Ambassador Friedman, Secretary of State Pompeo, the decision makers during the previous administration signaled to the Palestinians in their way that you can't pay to slay. What you mean paying the families of terrorists who get stipends for life, if one of their relatives blew herself or himself up and took a lot of Jews with them, pay for slay won't work. The Taylor Force Act that's still the law in the United States. They moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which wasn't so much a Palestinian issue, more of a Syrian issue, but Assad wasn't really in a position to say very much. It said a lot, but it didn't matter. They didn't call Israeli settlements legitimate, but they said for the first time that Israeli settlements are not illegal per se, which is a nuanced way of acknowledging that these aren't necessarily occupied territories. They closed down the Palestinian office in Washington, and they closed down their own consulate in Jerusalem, which essentially was a de facto embassy that didn't report to the ambassador in Tel Aviv, and it was not in East Jerusalem, it was right smack on Hebron Street. You guys know Israel a little bit. It's sort of nestled in between the, used to be the Sheraton Plaza, I keep changing the name of that hotel, but, and the King David, and the Lyon hotels. So that's not East Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Arabs have to come all the way into that part of the city in order to get consular services. Trump said he was going to reopen, Biden said he was going to reopen that, and he hasn't, and he won't. I mean, the pushback in Israel on that issue is stronger. I hope that nobody's ever forced to make that choice, but I think if Israel said, listen, if Israel was told, you need to choose between having the embassy in Arnona moved back to Tel Aviv, or reopening the consulate that's essentially going to service the Palestinians, I don't know what they say, but they might not say, okay, reopen the consulate, because that really is a negative signal to the rest of the world that the Palestinians are really having their own de facto embassy in the heart of West Jerusalem. So I don't think that'll happen, even though that's one of the things Biden said he would do. Biden also said he's going to rejoin the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Obama-Iran deal, which was signed in 2015. And that hasn't happened. And it hasn't not happened because people haven't tried. They've tried over the course of 5, now they're about to have a 6th meeting. And I personally don't talk about my own political predilections here. I haven't in years past, I'm certainly not going to start now. But I had something to say when that deal was being considered. I actually went to Washington twice as part of an AIPAC effort to speak with members of Congress, both in the House and Senate, about the deal. I wasn't very happy when it was negotiated and signed. I thought it was very flawed on so many levels that we can talk about, but I think all of us here are pretty aware of what those are. The words from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken were we're going to extend and strengthen the deal. So it's going to be a stronger deal. And the Iranians just are saying no. The reason why the deal has not been resuscitated is not because of a lack of American resolve or a lack of international resolve. It's Iranian obstinance. And I think from Israel's perspective, they're happy that this deal has not been resuscitated, because there's a lot of fear that it just sets a path to the bomb. That having been said, neither, while the deal was suspended, under the Trump administration, or during the pendency of these negotiations over the past year plus since the Biden administration took office, has Iran stopped its course towards pursuing a nuclear weapon. Now, we feel that this is of potentially tragic consequences. We know from history when people say they want to kill you, you take them for their word. They want to destroy you, you take them for their word. But this is technology that's been around for 76 years. Very many countries have nuclear power, certainly civilian nuclear power. Quite a few countries have nuclear weapons. Pakistan has a lot of nuclear weapons. That's an Islamic country, so there is a Muslim bomb, if you will. But I think that it's a credit to the administration that they didn't cave on some of their initial requirements. They did throw out a few cookies, and you could argue whether or not from a negotiating tactic you want to give people a few cookies as part of keeping them engaged in the conversation. But the big grand bargain hasn't happened. And I think that's because this administration has been a little bit more ambitious, and it doesn't want to ignore the sunset provisions. It doesn't want to ignore the other malfeasance that Iran is perpetuating in the Middle East and across the world, the intercontinental ballistic missile program, and other escalations of its conventional weapons program. So there are many things that the Biden administration has done over the past year that I think are worthy of commendation. And Trump supporters would argue that, well, the seeds were planted while he was president. So unemployment went from 6.2% to 3.9%. 3.9% is a very, very, very low unemployment. I can tell you from our perspective in the company, it's hard to get good people. And people are demanding more for their work. And just 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, we were looking at numbers, unemployment numbers that were staggering. In certain sectors, like the hospitality sector, they went to zero because of the pandemic. And now it's just very hard to find people who are willing to work, and people have many more options, and the culture of work has shifted. It hasn't transformed, but many people are now comfortable having multiple jobs, working from home, managing their own careers in a much more entrepreneurial way, whether it's within or from outside a more conventional working platform. And I think over the long term, that's good. 6 million jobs have been added during this period of time too. That's unprecedented in 1 year. That's a big deal. So the vaccination rollout, the vaccine, and here's another shout out to the Trump administration, even though he seemed extremely, I would say, unscientific regarding his public communications about COVID. The impetus to develop the vaccine was laudable and successful. Never in history, certainly not since you required all these FDA approvals, has there ever been such a fast accomplishment and an effective accomplishment. I mean, all of us are here, we're sitting in the room now without masks, most of us, 3 shots in our arm, most of us, and we're feeling relatively well protected, and for good reason, because the vaccine works. And the vaccine rollout worked as well, and with some things that the Biden administration attempted to do were shut down by the Supreme Court, like requiring all employees and companies who employ over 100 people to either approve vaccination or get tested once a week. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. You can't force people to do that. Same with certain healthcare workers, although there the Supreme Court came out with a more nuanced decision. Some healthcare workers can be required to prove vaccination. For those Canadians in the room, I was asked by my parents what would be a way to get, and I think this is working in the United States too, what would be a way to get more people vaccinated, because that's been a challenge in many countries. Just don't cover their health costs with insurance. So if you break your hand, you get a cast, that's covered. If God forbid you have another illness, and then look, you can argue, well, what about if you smoke? Should you be covered for lung cancer? It's a slippery slope, and this is not the purpose of this conversation. But I do think that the economics drive personal choice in very many instances, and I believe, this is a side comment, that if people have to pay for their health care costs, look, the people who have 3 shots and do get sick, they get Omicron. That was another thing that the Biden administration, I don't think, anticipated. I think it reminds me of a very unfortunate scene where President Bush landed on a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf with a big banner, mission accomplished. And that was maybe 2 or 3 months into the Iraq War. And here, we are almost 20 years, not quite 20 years later, but yeah, 17, 18 years later, and that mission has certainly not been accomplished, even though the troops are out in Iraq. So we didn't conquer COVID. We did not conquer COVID in the summer of 2021. Delta came out, and then now we have Omicron, and people say there's Omicron too. I think that if we look forward between now and the midterms, this is going to be the subject of the last class, so we'll get into much greater detail. One of the biggest tests for the Biden administration will be how it how it coped with COVID. Again, in Canada, I think there were certain periods during the pandemic where Justin Trudeau couldn't get re-elected dog catcher in Ottawa, and then when there was an election, the sense was that the way that the pandemic was dealt with was relatively successful. I think he didn't do as well as expected to when he called the election, but he didn't suffer from the COVID penalty in the same way that President Trump did in there's no COVID. Statistically speaking, it was quite likely, much more likely than not, before the COVID, that President Trump would have been reelected. And I think that one of the things that hurt him a lot was how he dismissed the seriousness of the disease and blamed it on China. Not within his own base, but his own base he could do no wrong. So I think that Biden has an opportunity here. I think Biden has an opportunity to be more realistic when it comes to Build Back Better. I think that he just didn't get it. I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the play Hamilton, but one of my favorite scenes is when President Washington goes to Alexander Hamilton and says, "You don't have the votes. You just don't have the votes." And Biden, after 36 years of experience in the Senate, 50 years of experience in politics, looks at a razor thin. It's not even a majority, it's 50-50 in the Senate. So Kamala Harris, the vice president, is a tiebreaker. But it should have been 50-50 to begin with. Trump essentially gave the Senate to the Democrats because if you remember, the general election was a very weird situation. Normally, senators are elected for 6-year terms. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. So here you had 2 senators from Georgia up for election the same year. You have Kelly Loeffler in a special election, and Purdue, and they both won plurality of the votes in November. But you need a majority in Georgia. It's one of those states where you need a majority, and plurality isn't quite enough. So in the runoff, you've got the president basically saying for a month and a half, the election is rigged, the process is rigged, the election was stolen. So mostly from within his own base, you had apathy. People said, "I don't want to participate in a rigged election," and Brian Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, the 2 Democratic contenders, are in the Senate. But so is Kristen Sinema from Arizona, and so is Joe Manchin. Ossoff and Warnock are pretty far to the left. Sinema and Manchin are not, and there are others who are not. I mean, they get most of the publicity because I think they like it, even though neither one of them is up for re-election this year. But Biden can't expect to legislate with a clear mandate that, this is not the New Deal of the 1930s or the Great Society of the 1960s, where both Roosevelt and Johnson had strong majorities in Congress. He has a very weak majority in Congress. And, there's an expression in sports, go big or go home. Well, he's going really, really, really big. I think a lot of his colleagues are going to be going home. Sadly, most of the people who are going to be going home are going to be moderate Democrats, because the progressive left-wing Democrats and the radical right Republicans, you've got, there's equal extremism when it comes to politics. They tend to get elected in deep blue or deep red congressional districts, because a Republican could never win this district. People here still think they're voting for FDR. And similarly, that a Democrat would have a very, very hard time getting elected in Orange County, California. Or a Republican getting elected in Austin, Texas. States that are considered to be Democratic states with strong Republican enclaves. And then the state, again, we'll say this for the last lecture on how state legislatures are impacting voting patterns and the future of both parties in the United States, which I find fascinating but also very disconcerting. As far as President Biden is concerned, his opportunity to scale back his legislative agenda, but make it realistic. Don't focus on things that you just can't win. Voting rights are important. One can debate whether or not access to polls is being limited by certain Republican legislative initiatives. But to try to force that down an unreceptive Senate is just, it's unrealistic. And it reflects poorly when you're just racking up all of these losses. And all of these things are correlated. When you're sitting in China and you're sitting in Russia and you're looking at a president who can't get his agenda done, you're not yearning for democracy, right? Like I said, China's going to get its own course, its own class, and it merits more. It merits really the whole course. And we're watching the Olympics right now. And the Olympics will be over by this. Remember, there's no class next week. Next class on February 25th. But you know, China showcased its emergence onto the world stage in 2008 with the Beijing Summer Olympics, and there wasn't really much political controversy, even though there was a lot of discrimination against the Uyghurs then too. It's obviously been exacerbated over the past 14 years. But when these other countries see a weak president, or see the riots of January 6th that went on in Charlottesville, Virginia, what goes on in Minneapolis, where Black Lives Matter are looting stores and burning downtowns all over the country, democracy doesn't look so appealing. And remember, even if there wasn't a screen or a filter on what they're allowed to see, and there is, if they had panoramic, omniscient visibility into everything that's happening, it still looks pretty bleak. And yet we believe, and I certainly believe, that it's certainly what Churchill said, it's the worst system of government except for all the others. So, and I really believe that in true democracies, and I think we do live in a true democracy, people get the leaders they deserve. And I think that the way this president is governing is in all likelihood going to result in a strong signal sent in November that the country wants to change course a little bit. People aren't happy. People aren't happy with the inflation running at 7.5%, the highest it's been in over 40 years. And you don't need to look, just look over the past century in terms of how presidents just lost their mandate to govern because of high inflation. Jimmy Carter was the last one that comes to mind because it's been a very long time since. Reagan actually was higher inflation during the first years of Reagan's presidency, but he had time to recover. So I think that on the domestic front, COVID, inflation are the two biggies. Like what he can show that he's got more control over. I think that on the foreign policy front, getting Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords is more aspirational. That's maybe more of a Lyon Roth pet issue. But on a broader scale, how he deals with China, how he deals with Russia, how he deals with Iran, people are watching. People are watching, people care. I think that he should be extremely troubled by his low polls because he's not running for re-election, so whatever happens in the House of Representatives and perhaps even the Senate is not going to displace him from the presidency. Will he run again in 2024? He may or may not have made that decision, but I don't think we're going to hear any news about that until after the midterm elections. Again, something we'll talk about in the last class. But the real challenges on the table are very much Russia, very much China, and all the collateral stakeholders. You're talking about China, you're not just talking about China, you're talking about the Philippines, you're talking about Japan, you're talking about South Korea, you're talking about North Korea. You're talking about these expanding spheres of influence. So even if a revanchist Russia doesn't take over the Ukraine, they want to reclaim the Warsaw Pact, so to speak. And they don't understand why NATO is so aggressive to bring Ukraine into its membership. And I get that. And we're not going to have a whole class on Russia, so we'll spend 3 minutes on this now, and then I'll open up to questions. If I'm Putin, I'm not an apologist for Putin. Putin is a despot, he's a dictator, and the fact that they have these sham elections every once in a while doesn't mean that Russia benefits from a liquid democracy. But he also craves for the old Soviet Union. He feels dismantling the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And these are cultures, Russia, Iran, Persia, China, they think back to when they were global empires. So there were periods when they weren't, but they perceived those periods as being manifestations of gross global injustices. Same as the Jews, right? We haven't had our own sovereign nation for most of our history. And yet every day for 2,000 years we're clamoring for a return to Zion. We think it's our right. We think it's our right to have a sovereign homeland where Abraham went and where Moses returned to and where David and Solomon ruled and where the Maccabees defeated the Assyrians. It's our right to have that, right? So China harkens back to when it had regional influence. Russia yearns for when it had much broader influence. Ditto Iran. So I think that there's a way off this impasse. So the Olympics end in 1 week. There's certainly, after the bromance love fest between Putin and Xi Jinping at the beginning of the Olympics, there's not going to be a war until next Saturday, so you guys can relax for 8 days if you're planning to visit Ukraine. Hurry up. Even Biden recently told Americans to get out of Ukraine now. I don't think the Ukrainians were happy. I think Zelensky is displeased that there's some more mongering going on, because that doesn't help him politically. But I think the president could do a little bit more in terms of coordinating. I mean, France and Germany and Great Britain have all said things against Putin's pretensions over Ukraine and the possibility of invasion, but these are coordinated comments, and they all have different interests. And Olaf Scholz, who replaced Angela Merkel as the Chancellor of Germany, he really wants that natural gas. He needs it. And Boris Johnson, I mean, a big swath of the London economy is fueled by all these Russian oligarchs running around. So there are different considerations. But NATO, I think NATO was a treaty alliance where every single member state signs on to defend any other member state if they're invaded. Do you think Belgium or Italy or Spain wants to go to war to defend Ukraine's territorial borders? Ukraine was never really an independent country for most of the past several centuries. It was controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Soviet Union, and Poland had control for a period of time. So there's no real appetite within Europe for that. And I think that maybe encouraging the Europeans to integrate Ukraine into the EU, again, where the dollars express themselves, I think, more persuasively than bullets, might be a better idea. But those are things that I'm sure people are thinking about a lot more than I am. But I believe the tools are there. I think that there's enough there to enable the Russians to get the things that they want from the West, particularly, again, economically, particularly with respect to their natural gas and other natural resources, precious metals, that sanctions lifted on several of Putin's buddies haven't been able to take their yachts everywhere they want to go, or at least anchor them anywhere they want to anchor them. So there are some cookies that the West can give Putin. I think there are fewer things that the West can offer Xi Jinping, but the balance of power, comparing Russia to China, this will be just a commercial for the next class, is all wrong. China is a superpower. China is a very strong country, and China is getting stronger all the time. Russia is a very weak country, and it's getting weaker all the time. And Putin raced over to Beijing to embrace Xi Jinping as part of this expression of solidarity. They did issue a joint communique that was stronger than anything, right? Two communist countries were buddies during the 50s and 60s, and then they had the schism, and then they had Nixon to go to China in 72. Now, and they had all this rhetoric, now they have a real pact, a real alliance against the West, against the rest. And, but if the Olympics were held in Moscow, I don't think Xi Jinping would have run over there to embrace it. This is not a relationship among peoples. This is a relationship among a Russia who desperately needs a superpower friend in the world, and a superpower who's making friends all over the world. But if you want to know more about that, we'll see on the 18th, on the 25th, sorry, not on the 18th. So with this, I'm going to thank you and take questions.
Biden's choice of people to assist him, for example, the Iranian issue, Thomas Malloy, who, from my understanding or recollection, he was anti-Israel and pro-Iranian. during the Obama administration, and a weak Secretary of State and a weak manager, where can he go with these poor assistants?
You forgot Wendy Sherman.
Can you repeat each question?
Yes. The question on the table is, what can we expect from an administration that has chosen either weak emissaries, anti-Israel emissaries, or both? Is that a fair characterization? Okay. So I was sort of tongue-in-cheek about Wendy Sherman. She did negotiate the previous JCPOA. She negotiated the nuclear treaty with North Korea during the Clinton administration. So she had
a bunch of Syrians.
So she has credentials. Thomas Malloy, I don't want to go so far as to say that, but without getting into like the nitty-gritty of who is what. And I don't think Tony Blinken is a weak Secretary of State. I think he's actually a pretty effective Secretary of State. I think that the way that they're comporting themselves on the Iran deal, remember, this is an administration that got elected saying that we're going to re-engage Iran, we're going to resuscitate the JCPOA. Not brilliant from a negotiating standpoint, right? You don't necessarily want to tell the other party that yes, we're desperate to get you back in, but the statements were ambiguous. They say the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so the process over the past 13 months, and as I mentioned in my remarks, not for lack of trying, has been encouraging insofar as yes, we want to re-engage Iran, but not on any terms and not at any price.
They just gave him $26 billion.
That's $26 billion is a lot of money for everybody here in the room. Unfortunately, in today's global economy, it's a rounding error. So, I mean, are they doing what I wish they would do? If I could sort of wave a magic wand and have some influence over American foreign policy, especially as it deals with Iran, probably not. But are they doing a little bit better than I feared? Yes. Am I optimistic that we're going to see any sort of happy arrangement with the Iranians? I don't. And I think that as a consequence, sorry to beat up this point, maybe Saudi Arabia does get into the Abraham Accords. Maybe Israel becomes increasingly indispensable to other countries in the region who see that the United States is not able to deal with Iran. I think that the biggest gift that the Iranians are giving everybody else is that there's really no confusion as to who they are and what they want. You know, what you always are fearful of is somebody lying. And I mean, obviously they cheat, but they're not lying. They're not saying, oh yes, we want to be your best friend, come and let's have dinner, let's have coffee, and I'll go to your bar mitzvahs and you come to our, celebrations. They're not doing that. They're extremely clear about what they want, and they're extremely intransigent about how they're negotiating, which is why deals are taking place. Yes?
All right. Let's talk something domestic now. We have in Canada a truckers boycott. Next month we're going to have one in the U.S. What do you feel the government, what do you feel the government's reaction is going to be to it?
The question is, we have a truckers protest in Canada, in Ottawa, that basically shuts down Centertown, and that you predict that there will be one in the United States.
They already said starting in March. Yes.
Okay, so we're going to have a truckers revolt in March in the United States.
Heading from California to Washington.
Okay, those are a lot of trucks.
All right, they'll be there.
They'll be there. Look, so obviously you never want to see, an entire city, especially, your nation's capital shut down. I think that more could be done to have some sort of dialogue. I think Shakespeare should write about, Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, and the specter of his father. I don't really remember this, but I was alive and living in Montreal at the time when Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act and brought the Canadian military. There were actually tanks in the street of Montreal in 1970 because of the FLQ, Federation de Quebec, which is sort of, the terrorists. And I think his father did a good job. And when asked how far do you think you'll go, he said, just watch it. And, but, I'm not here to criticize the Prime Minister of Canada, but I don't think that this is the most effective response. I think doing one of two things might be more effective. Either engaging in a dialogue, which he's not doing, so the truckers feel like they got no one to talk to, or that their grievances are not legitimate, and you know this, whether it's from negotiating with a business partner, or parenting a child, or dealing with anybody who seems intransigent by not at least indulging them a little bit and feeling like their grievances are legitimate, you're just exacerbating the problem. Or he can take a page from his father's playbook. I mean, if you do remember, as I don't, but I read about what was going on in the world at the time in the 1970s, Canada could have been a hotbed for these terrorist movements. The FLQ could have evolved into the Baader Meinhof gang or you know other really bad actors that did a lot of terrible things for a long time. So I don't think that's the threat. I think really and I'm watching this more closely than perhaps some other Americans because it is Canada. I think that people are just extraordinarily frustrated by what seems like very heavy-handed impositions to them, not to me. It would seem to them to be very heavy-handed impositions and restrictions, and they want to be heard. I think that what they're doing is unpalatable, but I think that the current response, or more accurately non-response, is increasingly proving itself to be ineffective. And if there is this protest from California or Washington, which I haven't heard about, but if there is, then hopefully the Americans will learn some lessons from the Canadians and do things differently. We'll learn a lesson from the Canadians and do things differently. Yes.
Let's go back to the Iranian Accord. Excuse me. Well, the same people that negotiated the first accord is negotiating the second accord. The first accord was terrible, and it seemed like we are chasing after the Iranian to make a deal. The negotiation, we're not a strong negotiator. We're giving everything back to the Iranian. First of all, with Iran is producing ballistic missiles all the time. They are producing the missiles to put in storage. Ballistic missiles has nuclear weapons. Look what's happening. Let's go back to Yemen. What's happening with the Houthis, with the Yemen? They're shooting ballistic missiles all over the place and creating havoc.
Yeah, what's the question?
Well, the question is, before I'm giving you a little bit background.
Okay, with respect, sir, I covered pretty much all these things except for the Houthis. If you have a question, I'd like to answer it.
Okay. My question is, you ask why we have to get back Saudi Arabia. And the question is, how can we get back Saudi Arabia if we don't support it with Yemen, we don't support it with the Iranian Accord, and we just let it go?
Well, is that your question? Okay, I think it's an excellent question. I'll repeat it. I can't repeat everything you said, but I can repeat your question. So the question is, if I want or hope that the Saudi Arabians join the Abraham Accords, how can we ever expect that to happen if we don't support Saudi Arabia with respect to our position vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear ambitions and with respect to what's going on in Yemen, where the rebel Houthis are being supported by the Iranians, and that's literally on Saudi Arabia's doorstep, and the Saudis and the Emiratis are engaged in that fight. So it is a civil war taking place in Yemen. I do believe that I covered pretty much all the points that you made about the same people who negotiated the initial deal, negotiating this deal. To the extent I'm comfortable, I gave you my perspectives on what I think of the deal, but I've also expressed some lack of disappointment by the fact that a deal hasn't happened. We are not giving away the store. We're not kowtowing to the Iranians like I felt we did in 2015. With respect to Saudi Arabia, of course, Saudi Arabia would like more support in what's essentially a proxy war that they're fighting in Yemen. But the Saudis and the Emiratis are actively fighting in Yemen. The Iranians are fighting in Yemen through the Houthi. The Saudis and the Emiratis have wrought havoc with thousands of civilian casualties in Yemen because of pretty indiscriminate bombings with U.S.-made weapons. So I don't know that the United States is in a position to do much more than it already has to support the Saudis and UAE in Yemen. I think that the Iranians continue to signal to the world that they don't care about a rapprochement with the Saudis. I mean, this is not a course on Islam, but if you look at interfaith relations and the Abraham Accords, who's the father of Islam, the father of Ishmael, and then the Jews through Isaac, and derivatively Jesus, who was a Jew through Isaac, I guess. You're also nobody talks about the Sunni and the Shia. The Shia, actually, if you go back historically, they're the more moderate form of Islam, because the Iranians have given them a bad name. It would be very easy from an intra-faith dialogue for the Sunni and the Shia to get their act together, much more easily than Jews and Arabs, or Jews and Muslims, or even Muslims and Christians. But the Iranians are so adamant to just do things the way they insist on doing, including and especially in Yemen. And the Yemenis did use, the Iranians are not actually presently on the ground in Yemen like the Saudis and the Emiratis are, but Iranian-made ballistic missiles were fired from Yemen into the UAE. And if you think that the Houthis would do that without Iranian consent, I disagree with you. So you're right. You're absolutely right. Now, the United States doesn't really have, I don't think it has any more of a role than it's already played. As far as what the United States can do vis-a-vis the nuclear ambitions of Iran, I agree with you 100%. When I mentioned that President Biden had a conversation with King Salman, but not with his son, which is unfortunate, but the conversation focused nearly exclusively on his assurances to the King that the United States is doing everything possible to prevent a nuclear event. Yes?
Do you think that this administration is responsible for the inflation?
For inflation? No, no. I mean, the question is, do I think this administration is responsible for inflation? What's responsible for inflation is printing money. I mean, if there are no economists in the room, then I'll volunteer to just give you a little, you know, the more you print, the more likely it is that people are going to, you know, want more for what they have, because there's more dollars out there to buy stuff. So once I've sold everything for $10, much more quickly than I anticipated, if I have the wherewithal to make more, I'm going to sell it for 12. And if I don't have the wherewithal to make more, I can't make another 10 units, and I can only make 3 units because of supply chain issues and all the other things that are going on in the world. I'll sell it for 15 or 20, the fewer items that I have. So inflation is inevitable. When you print the trillions of dollars that the Trump administration did to cope with COVID in 2020, when you print the 1.9 trillion extra dollars, the U.S. debt is at $30 trillion. I mean, I don't know if you ever remember that, Austin Powers movie where he's frozen for 30 years and he comes back and tries to hold the world hostage for, I don't know, like $10 million, some number, and they laughed at him. And he doesn't understand why they're laughing. He's claiming that's not so much money anymore. We're now in 1998. So he goes, okay, I'm now going to hold the world hostage for $100 billion. And they're shaking in their boots. And now fast forward 20-some years later, $100 billion, it's only $26 billion is a bit of a rounding error. We're talking about trillions of dollars. And a trillion here, a trillion there, it's pretty close. So at one point you're talking about a lot of money. So it's not this administration that's causing inflation. But if you look at the TARP program, the Treasury Assisted Relief Program following the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where Secretary of the Treasury Paulson and Bush, and then followed by Geithner and Obama, just literally printed money to get the United States out of the crisis. It worked. I mean, there had collateral effects, and maybe other things could have been done, but that was the serum that abated a much worse crisis. And that's true for COVID too. The stock market was tanking, people were out of work, there was very little assurance that things would get better economically, and for many people, and certainly for the stock market, they have. But there's a price to be paid for printing money, and inflation, 7.5% inflation, the highest it's been in 40 years, is the price that you pay. Now there's a price that you have to pay for interest, for inflation, and that's the cost of money. Interest rates are going to rise. Interest rates are going to rise at a pace that we haven't seen since 1994. But interest rates are at 0. They have to rise at some point. You can't have free money forever. The world just doesn't work that way. Yes.
Can you explain the reasoning behind the U.S. refunding UNRWA and now funding the military salaries in Lebanon without any control about what happens to that money?
So the question is about the U.S. I mentioned things that the Trump administration cut off. Another thing that it cut off was the funding of UNRWA. The UNRWA is UN RWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency. For those of you who don't know, the United Nations, since its inception, has seen as part of its mandate to deal with refugees under the United Nations Refugee program. There's another organization that's completely separate, which is UNRWA, that only deals with Palestinians. Look, I think UNRWA is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. And I don't care where you are on the political spectrum about this too. It's the only agency in the world that doesn't deal with refugees. It perpetuates the refugee problem. And that would be bad enough if it didn't also get involved in politics and did get involved in school book curriculum and get involved in all sorts of insidious social services that are not designed merely to help the people that the money is going to helping, but also to impact their minds, their opinions. So do I think these people are worthy of assistance? Absolutely. Do I think UNRWA should be shut down and reconstituted, and maybe the Palestinian refugee issue should integrate itself into refugee crises that take place all over the world? We have massive refugee challenges going on everywhere. Maybe as part of, maybe the Chinese talk, because Turkey's relevant to that too. We could talk about how, you know, the Syrian refugee crisis, the Afghani refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, you got Shelby in the room here, can tell you that didn't exist 6 months ago. Nobody's talking about it. These are millions of people who need a new place to live. And we had 5 million people who need a new place to live from 2011, maybe 15 if I'm wrong about the 5. So refugees have been around forever, right? I mean, we were refugees from famine, and we went from Canaan to Egypt. I mean, this is not a new issue. But as far as, I just want to finish the second part of the question. So as far as UNRWA is concerned, I think the politics are too entrenched. I don't think UNRWA is going to disappear. I think that it was the easiest cookie that the Biden administration could throw back to the Palestinians. They couldn't try to repeal the Taylor Force Act. They couldn't open the Jerusalem consulate. They were able to allow the Palestinians to reopen their offices in Washington. I don't know if that's actually happened yet. And refunding UNRWA was something that other countries in the world wanted. Wanted the United States to participate. UNRWA didn't go away because the United States stopped funding it, so just have to work with 75% of the resources that it had before. As far as paying the military in Lebanon, I don't know enough about that. I mean, I think that everybody's concerned about Lebanon. It's run by Hezbollah, which we recognize as being a terrorist organization. So maybe paying the salaries of the military. Lebanon is a thankless country. I mean, people don't talk about it. Afghanistan is obvious. It's in the news. Lebanon is a failed state. It is absolutely a failed state. There's no power. There's no running water. Congress has been shut down. So it's had a very challenging history for decades, and it's worse than it's ever been. And ever been includes the civil war of 75, 76, includes the Palestinian, incursion in 82. So it includes all the political assassinations, everything. This is worse than Lebanon has ever been. So if there isn't an effort, which I'm really not familiar enough to talk about the details, to help support the Lebanese military as a bulwark against Hezbollah for a little longer, I think that might be part of the motivation. Yes?
Maybe you can help me clarify 3 simple points, not related to the United States nor to Iran. The first one is Chile. Chile is the home of 100,000 Palestinians. Do you know more or less what percentage of Christians and Muslims? And do you think that the left has sufficient strength to change the constitution? First question. Second question is, Ashdod and Tel Aviv port, what happened to the Chinese investment now that the Israeli had to give the rail in Tel Aviv to Europeans? And the last one is, what's all about this conflict in the Knesset about the citizenship law?
Okay. So we'll take them one at a time. As far as Chile, I mean, I follow the world, so I do know that there's a very large Palestinian population in Chile. For the same reason, there's a very large Russian population in Sunny Isles. I'm not trying to make a joke out of this, but people go where their friends are. Right? I mean, you remember Fiddler on the Roof, on a death camp. I'm going to Chicago, I've got a cousin in Chicago. Okay, I'm going to Santiago, I've got a cousin in Santiago. So a cousin brings a cousin, so you have your whole famula, your whole tribe is moving to Chile. So yes, Chile has, and Detroit has a lot of Muslims. Dearborn in Michigan is a Muslim, like whether it's Thornhill or Cote St. Luke or Hampstead or whatever, Aventura, you've got a Jewish population. Jews want to live near Jews, and Palestinians want to live near Palestinians. And one of the reasons they like this obviously influences politics. I think there's a correlation between the fact that we have a very large, vibrant, healthy Jewish community in the United States, and we have our voices heard in Congress. It's not that they were, it's not the conspiracy theories of Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, but we do play way above our weight, and Palestinians play above their weight in Chile. And Chile, like many other Latin American countries, is trying to deal with economic turmoil and serious economic disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And populism is going to find a voice. It happened in Venezuela. It's happening in Peru. It's happening in Chile. Do I know whether or not they're going to be able to rewrite a constitution? That's beyond the scope of my sort of knowledge about the internal politics of Chile. Your second question was. So two ports are Ashdod and Haifa, and you're right. The Chinese, and this is for next class. So I'll just finish. And the Knesset I'll also leave for the third class, but because I see there's some other questions I need to leave too. But the ports in Ashdod and Haifa, the concession was given to a Chinese contractor, and the Americans went ballistic. Because ports are extremely sensitive places. It's not like, okay, I can park my boat, go have a hamburger, get back and go fishing. Ports are where large amounts of cargo are moved in and out, more cargo than people, and militaries. Remember, we talked about the Fifth Fleet in the Mediterranean, and that's my answer to your question. There was enough of a dialogue between the United States and Israel, and the relationship between the two countries is strong enough that there were restrictions on who can or cannot use the port. So the Port of Haifa is actually being operated by the Chinese, but Chinese military craft are not allowed to use the Haifa port, and the Fifth Fleet still does. So the only thing I can tell you from that is that the American security concerns were addressed by revisions that were made, or tweaks that were made, in order to enable the Chinese to have that. But then both with respect to water purification, the rail system, and several other infrastructure initiatives, the Chinese were shut out of the bidding process because of pressure that was put upon Israel during the last administration. So you had a question, yes?
Yes. You mentioned about China is growing economically, and that's because they're free in the aspect of economics, but not in the politics. So my question to you is, do you think that eventually this person is going to change his politics in order to make this new millionaires that now they're having, because it's easy now they're having money, but eventually, like this Alibaba, the person now he was kidnapped, they don't know. Do you think that he's going to eventually change his politics to give more freedom?
The head of China, Xi Jinping?
Yes.
Well, like I said, that's a subject for a whole class in 2 weeks. But I'll answer your question with a word: no, he's not. And as to why he's not, and what his options are, and what's happened to certain Chinese dissidents, and what's happened to certain Chinese billionaires, stay tuned for February 25th. We have a question here, yes?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I think it was quite formative, I guess, but there's a lot to unpack. And if we had an hour, perhaps we'd do that, but we don't. So I just have 2 questions. Number one, you didn't at all touch about the border issues in the U.S. Now, keep in mind, I'm Canadian. We voted for Trudeau 3 times, so I have no credibility. But what I'm asking is, in terms of the border, you didn't mention that at all. The thing that bothers me about this issue is that I hear the Democrats in the U.S. talk about a democratic policy. I hear them about the danger to democracy. On the other hand, here they are with the border issue. Here they are with states that essentially will not follow out some of the federal laws.
Is this still part of the first question? I don't mean
it's all part of the same question, yes.
So what's the first question about the
The
borders?
first question is the border. The second question is, how can you have states that do not follow laws in a democracy?
So, first of all, thank you for the kind compliment at the outset of the question. So I appreciate that from the heart. And I don't mean to cut you off, it's easier. So the questions for those to comment on U.S. border policy, I guess, is part of the conversation regarding President Biden's first year in office. And even though you're Canadian, you don't want me to comment exclusively on the Canadian border or general border policy. So the United States is lucky, first and foremost, that it has a very quiet eastern and western border. By definition, the western border is called the Pacific. So it's nice and quiet. Border issues with Canada, I mean, aside from Windsor, Detroit, what you're seeing now with the trucks and everything, I think is you know, pretty easy thing. I don't know if you were trying to sort of circumvent the word, if you're asking about immigration policy in the United States, without having called it that, and assume that's what you want me to comment on. Look, immigration policy.
No, sorry, you misunderstand. Number one, I'm talking about the immigration from Mexico or from the Latin American countries to the U.S.
Right, that's what I meant.
And number two, I'm talking about what do they call them, cities that are basically
Refugee cities.
yeah.
Yeah, so
That's what I'm talking.
So you are talking about immigration policy. You're absolutely talking about immigration policy.
No.
So, sorry.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Call it something else. Okay. Call it a butterfly. You're asking me about the migration of people from one place to another. I'm going to call that immigration. Okay. So the immigration issue. Pardon?
Illegal.
Illegal immigration. So illegal immigration is you're here without a visa. Illegal immigration also means you come here as a tourist and you never leave. If you decide that you really like Florida, you don't go back to Canada, you're an illegal immigrant. You won't want to see yourself that way, but you are. And the United States has an issue because a lot of people want to come here. And the more people come here from Latin America because it's easier. It's harder to get here from Ireland. But we had a lot of immigration for centuries, and I certainly believe in legal immigration as being preferable to illegal immigration. I certainly think the United States should have more control over its borders. I've seen Republican and Democratic administrations try many different things to improve the situation with limited success. I think that there's a huge opportunity for bipartisan immigration reform in this country, and in most countries. But it's much starker in the United States because people want to be here. And there isn't the type of repression on the way that you have in Europe. Like, for example, when you have the massive influx of refugees from the Middle East into Europe, Europe made a deal with Erdogan and Turkey. We'll pay you money to just use your Turkish charm to prevent a further influx of brown people into our white continent. And I'm not saying this is a racist. I'm just saying that was the message that was sent from Brussels to Ankara, through Berlin and Paris and Rome and every other state capital in between.
And Brexit.
That's a separate conversation. Brexit was a reaction to that. Brexit was a reaction. All right, we don't want to be part of an economic union where people who've already escaped Erdogan's clutches can now migrate freely from the banlieue outside of Paris to to central London, or Manchester, or Liverpool, or any of the other countries in the United Kingdom. I think that the border issue is not going to be solved anytime soon. I think that as long as you're going to have persistent economic malaise across Central and South America, there's going to be too much of an incentive to stop it. You couldn't stop alcohol and prohibition because people wanted to drink too much. You're not going to, if you couldn't stem the flow of booze in the 30s, you're not going to stem the flow of people in this century until there is, it'll never stop, but until there's an extremely sophisticated concentration of resources, carrots and sticks, applied south of Mexico. We're gonna have this problem for a long time, because as unattractive as the United States may seem to a lot of people, it's massively more attractive than all of the places that people are coming here from. So, yeah.
I have one more question.
Okay.
Can I ask you? The question about the counseling to open up the counseling, Palestinian counseling in Jerusalem. Don't you think the United States tried to undercut Israel as Jerusalem as the united capital?
Yes. The question is, do I think that the United States would have undermined Israel's jurisdiction over its own capital city had it? Yes. The answer is not only do I agree with you, but much more importantly, the Israeli government agrees with you, and that's the reason why it has not been reopened, and that's the reason why I predict, and I'll end with this prediction, I don't think it will be reopened anytime soon. Thank you very much, and much